It is a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to talk about building for the edge with Nuxt. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why building for the edge in a moment. But first, you probably don't need any emojis. My name's Daniel. As Alex said, I'm on the Nuxt team. So I spend a lot of my time building cool features and fixing less cool bugs. My background is an agency and a SaaS before I was a core maintainer for Nuxt. And so very much everything that we're building, it has to be something that for me is exciting and I would value using myself. That's the perspective I'm coming at it from. I'm aware that lots of people have different perspectives when they approach open source. And of course, solving fun puzzles is a good motivation too. This is my working environment. So if you're ever, if we're chatting on Discord or there's a GitHub issue, I'm probably sitting here with a mug of coffee and some code in front of me. And one of my cats, I have got 3 and a dog. So that is the idyllic life that I have come from in the northeast of England to this hip and happening city. I do not live in a hip and happening city. So if you don't know what Nuxt is, which I realize from the show of hands may be a small number of people, Nuxt is a progressive framework. So it's a way to build web applications that allows you to start with almost no extra knowledge required. You can just get going. You code in Vue, and a lot of best practices built in for you. So things like your build configuration, your SSR configuration, how to optimize performance, that kind of thing. It's all built into Nuxt. And this has always been true since the beginning of Nuxt, and certainly if you're using Nuxt 2, you'll recognize this is the case. Nuxt has also always been about multiple different targets, which is what sometimes brings unique challenges to development, because you're building not just for the browser, but also for a server, which is going to render the HTML and serve it up to your browser. And then that has to be hydrated and matched up with the client bundle. So Nuxt has always had Node, legacy, and modern bundles. And the reason I mention that is because we're coming into a world where it's not just a browser and a server that we're talking about. Another thing that makes Nuxt unique is its ecosystem. So there is a vibrant modules ecosystem, and there are people here today who maintain modules in the Nuxt ecosystem. And I will say that without that ecosystem, Nuxt would not be anything like what it is. It means that if you want to get started with an app and you have a CMS you want to integrate, or you have you want to run some validation, or you want to implement some kind of authentication or something like that, there's a module for it. So go to modules.nuxtjs.org and you can see some of the many different ones that you can implement. Lots of things are changing in the modern internet, in the modern web framework, web platform. And that's not true just from the point of view of the browser, but also from the point of view of the technology that serves up content to the browser. So we're no longer talking just so much about a server that sits and runs for some long period of time, rendering request after request. We're talking about individual serverless functions that might spring up on demand, close to a user, render a response, and then expire gracefully. Maybe if there are lots of requests coming in, the servers pop up. There are many functions handling those requests. And this obviously brings different challenges. From the point of view of building a server for Nuxt, that means that we want something not that it's going to be optimized for long life, but something that's going to be optimized for a quick start. There are also really interesting developments from the point of view of Jamstack. The cynical among you will think that we're going in a circle, that we went from server HTML, think PHP templates, to JavaScript front-ends and single-page apps, and now we're going back again. But it's not that, really. What we're optimizing for is the best performance for end users, of course. So if you can make something static, you want to. Some things have to be dynamic. You want those to be dynamic. And ideally, you should be able to put something that's hybrid, that has the best of all worlds, maybe static HTML, that is enriched on client side with dynamic data coming in from somewhere else. There are new targets like Dino or a Cloudflare Workers environment that's more browser-like, or even Bun. And we are in a world where ES modules are gradually winning the fight. So, what remains important is what we want to talk about today, what it looks like to build an application with Nuxt. And so there's lots that I could say, but I would rather show. Now, I have got to confess something, and I hope you will extend some kindness to me, because the API I was going to use today has decided to go down. Here is a view of the API that I was hoping to build a little app around. It's called Cat as a Service. Sadly, not its serviceable state at the moment. So we started with a little Nuxt application. And all I've done is add an environment variable file with a token, which I've obtained from a rival Cat as a Service API called the Cat API. You'll notice if you start a new Nuxt 3 application that it is incredibly minimal, certainly maybe compared to what you might be expecting with Nuxt. Let's start on some better port. What you might be expecting with Nuxt 2. So if you go ahead and start a Nuxt 3 project, you'll see just a welcome page. We're going to do something with an API. I want to show you a little bit about what it looks like, because I want to show you how that then can be deployed in a static fashion, in a hybrid fashion to the cloud. And we'll see what we get to. What you'll notice straight away is that we have got things like type support for the components that we use throughout our app, and lots besides. That's all powered by this generated tsconfig file. When you run your Nuxt server, it actually generates this tsconfig for you, including all kinds of aliases to different things that would previously have been available to you, say, in a Nuxt 2 environment, but you might not have known about. So it means that when you actually come to import something, for example, you actually get access to these aliases, and you can import from them directly if you need to. TypeScript knows all about that. It also powers things like auto-imported components. If you create a component in your Nuxt application, we will call this cat, and we can use it maybe later on. If you create a component in your Nuxt application and you say this is going to be our cat, you'll be able to use that in a type-safe way throughout your app. The folder is called components, just so you know. We now have a type definition for cat, and it's now hopefully visible to us all. That means if you did something like define some props for it, using the script setup method, or even my own personal favorite, the old methodology, you would now have type safety for that in your application. You would be able to see that it takes a name property. That's really nice. It means you don't have to think about a lot of things you might otherwise need to think about. And if you're creating plugins, so code that runs on the server or client side, it's as simple as creating a file again. So you might have some authentication plugin that you create. And if we just want to console log hi, you'd be able to see straight away that that is going to run in your browser. It's going to run on your server. You don't need to register it anywhere, it just works. If you're used to the old Nuxt 2 pattern of returning things, or injecting some global state in an application, you can still do that in Nuxt 3. You can use a method to do it, but personally, I much prefer this way, returning an object, because again, you get access to some lovely type safety. So you can see in the template when you're using it, or if you're using it in your script setup, you immediately are able to see what has been injected and what the properties are on that. And of course, that means if that changes at any point, when you run your type check step, you'll be able to find out what's broken and why. You're not relying on magic values that JavaScript just thinks are always fine. Let's do some interesting server stuff. So one of the things that Nuxt 3 comes with is this new server called Nitro, which powers a lot of the cool things I'm going to show you today. And a lot of that is going to happen in the server API folder. So we're going to create a file called cats.get. And this is simply going to return an array of cats. So if I hit that API endpoint, I'm going to hit the right port, it's going to come back with an empty array. Now, we're going to pretty much have to do this on the fly, because it was only a few minutes ago that I found that this thing is down. So let's create a little type-safe API. We're going to hit something called the cat API. I want to do a little bit of validation for it, so we're going to install the package called Zod. We have access in a Nuxt 3 application to this helper called fetch. It can do a number of nice things for us. So it can perform external API requests like this one. So we can fetch, let's make this an async function. And we're going to fetch from this API. We want, that seems fine to me. And then we're just going to return that result. I think at this point that's probably going to work. OK, we've got some stuff. So no then our JSON or anything like that. It automatically unwraps it for us. And there's some other nice features that it's got. I mentioned I created an environment variable here, Nuxt cat API token. If you want to use environment variables in your Nuxt application, we have something called runtime config, which means you can build your app and then change them later on. So you can have one app, say a Docker image, that gets deployed to production and staging. Best practice, right? We don't want to include that in the build somehow. We certainly don't want it to be in your client-side JavaScript. So we're just going to create something called cat API token. And it's important that this matches the environment name. So Nuxt is the prefix, and then cat API token is a sort of uppercase version of this. I'm just going to set it to nothing, but Nuxt is automatically going to look for environment variables set and fill that up for us. So now I'm just going to use that here to perform, to add a header in this fetch request. So we need to add this X API key header. And we're going to use a composable called use runtime config, which is typed. So we can pull in cat API token. That should still return, I think, the same information. The only difference, the difference is we get some breed information. We probably want to specifically add this has breeds attribute so that we get some things that are slightly more interesting. Anything else? I think random is probably fine. We can set limit as 10. Now, what I always like to do when I'm hitting an endpoint, particularly one that I don't know, is add some, when I'm not in control of it, is add some validation. So we're going to import something from Zod, which is a validator library, and we're going to define our cat type. And our cat type is going to be this. It seems to have height, ID, URL, and width. So we're going to create an object which has those properties. Now it looks to me like these are strings. So we're going to validate them as strings. And these are numbers, so we'll validate those as numbers. We also have breed, which is a little bit larger, but we'll just focus on some of them. That's an array. and it has an object in it, which, again, has got some properties. We probably only care about name. Are you interested in validating API requests? So I'm very interested in validating API requests. We could spend some time focusing on this. Let's just pull in some at random here. We can use them later. We want a temperament and maybe a description. So that seemed like a good array of things we can build something with. So we've now got this object, and we'll call it cats, and we'll wrap it in an array as well, because we want to validate a whole response. And this array should be non-empty. OK, that's a pretty good definition of what it is that we're expecting to come from this endpoint. And we're just going to return not our original result, but we are going to parse our response here. Now that's going to do two things for us. So one is it's going to ensure that the data we have coming back matches what we're expecting. And two is it's actually going to mutate the response so it's exactly what we expect. It's going to remove properties that don't exist in our original schema. Oops. OK. Now, we're going to do something with that in our app. Now, the app here is just a wrapper around the actual app that we want to build. Before we go much further, I'm just going to install something called Pico CSS. Pico CSS is a nice, light, minimal CSS library, so we'll pull that in there. Beautiful. That can be a container. And this app is going to wrap everything else. So if we're going to want some pages on our application, we just create a pages directory. You'll see, by the way, if I try to use this component called Nuxt page, it doesn't exist yet. Because if you don't have a pages directory, Nuxt knows you probably don't need it. So the view router integration isn't included in your app. Instead, something that is a super minimal router replacement is included in your app. We can actually have a little look at the data you'll get. So it will look the same, but it will be much smaller. You probably want to have view router, though. Giving Eduardo a glance just to view router, you definitely want it. But if you create a pages directory and stick some files in it, you get the magic of those automatically created roots. And you also see that suddenly that root object has filled out. And if we save this, you'll see now that we have got a home page. So what we're going to do here is just give ourselves a little list of cats, really. That's sort of the idea I'm going for at this point. We're going to use a Nuxt composable called useFetch. And we can pass this endpoint API cats. In fact, Nuxt already knows that this endpoint exists for us. And in fact, it knows what type is going to come back from that endpoint because it's been validated by Zod. We're going to do a little bit more, though. This breeds thing is a little bit weird. It's an array, and I really want all that on the list of cats. So I'm going to transform the cats to, we'll map each cat to, I think, probably just the properties of the cat. We'll set breeds to nothing. And then we will map on breeds because we know that it exists. It's non-empty. So this way we should have something that looks a little bit more like that. Seems right. Which means that now we can iterate over them in a perfectly type-safe way here. So we can say cat in cats, key is going to be, we probably need to capture the cat ID. Do we have it? Oh, we have it. Excellent. And we can say something like the cat, what do we want? The name. It's going to be the breed name. Cats of the world. Ah, perfect. We've got a little list that we've fetched. Now, I told you about that magical $fetch. Now, one of the things about this is that if it's called from the browser, it's going to make a network request. But if it's called on the server side, it will actually directly call the function responsible. So in this case, it's used by this composable useFetch to directly execute this handler. So cats gets executed. It looks for all the world to the handler like it's being called from a network request, but in fact it's not, which is one way we can make the server response much, much faster. There's another thing as well. This is an external API, and it's not really going to change. So I'm actually going to use a cached event handler, which is automatically going to apply some optimizations, and I'm specifically going to enable stale while revalidate, which means that I haven't yet applied it. If I hit API cats here, it's a little bit slow. Oh, it's actually getting something it's not expecting. It needs to have a Wikipedia URL. So let's say that Wikipedia URL is optional. Okay, let's try that. Unfortunately, that means I have to save the file. You should see it's actually taking a little bit of time to come back, and that's not our fault, that's the API. But if we use this stale while revalidate handler, the first request might take a bit longer, but subsequent requests, maybe we're in dev mode, we're still hitting it. It will actually store that the response in production in a temporary memory cache and actually return the previous response for us. So we can do that, and that will give us a bit of extra performance benefit. There's something else I think we can do here at this point. Let's create a little grid. And this is more just for fun. I thought maybe, in view of the fact that we're displaying some cats, we also ought to display a cat. And we also ought to link to a page, maybe, where we can see each of these cats. So let's do that. Let's create a page called cat, and then we can have a dynamic parameter ID. And that's going to be able to take the root ID and then do something with it. So we can say root params ID. And then maybe we can link to that here. We can use Nuxt link, by the way, for both internal and external links. It handles everything for you, including adding extra no-referrer params if you're linking to an external site. Let's link to the cat Wikipedia URL. Although they might not all exist. Okay. Oh no, we don't want to link to the Wikipedia URL. We want to link to cat ID. Okay, so now we have some cat IDs, and we can link to a specific page. And if we go there, you can see that the page exists, I promise. There we go. We've got our cat ID. We might also want to do some kind of other information in that particular page, like show some information about the cat. So we can have maybe a cat ID API as well. And we'll copy and do a similar kind of thing. We're going to validate the cat. And in a larger project, you'd probably have a shared utility, so you don't have to do this. What are we going to pull in? It is going to be images and then the image ID like this. We're going to need to pull that ID. So we can say ID, read params, get router param. That's it. And that can be an ID. We'll just do it like this. And hopefully that's going to give us a response. Let's give it a try with this one. What did we say it was? Like that? Great. It all seems to be working fine for us, and it's all validated too. So we can display that on the page. We can say const cat is probably fine, but that's probably what we want. And we want to display some information about the cat. Let's just check that's coming through. Beautiful. So we might want to say, put a little header and say this is going to be cat name. Name? Oh, we didn't do our transform. That's very useful, isn't it, when TypeScript can tell you that, that maybe that property doesn't exist in the way you expect it to be. Let's stick it there. We want to map cat in that kind of way. So we should hopefully have a name now. And we probably want some information about the cat, so we'll just create a paragraph and say cat description. And we want an image. We should have that, right? URL. Now what I can't recall is whether that URL is going to be, yeah, full URL. Okay, so there we go. And we could even have then a link back to the home page. Probably stick that in app.view. We give that a little nav and put a link there. It's not looking beautiful, but there it is. Okay, so we've got our list of cats, and for each cat we have got a bit of a description. I'm not going to sweat the appearance of it. Let me show you a couple of other things that you can do with Nuxt before we look at some of the benefits we would be able to receive when we're deploying an app like this to production. Imagine for a moment that we wanted to do something very cool, like stick a little 3D image of a cat here. You'll see this is the tutorial I found yesterday when I thought I would do something like this. I had a quick look at this library called vuejs. It's all the coolest library. That is probably not the right pronunciation, but let's just install it. We probably also need 3. Yeah. And I want to show you 2 things when we do this. So we're going to create a little 3D canvas. And this 3D canvas requires access to, let's actually just use that component we created earlier called cat. And we'll stick the 3D canvas here. Now this 3D canvas requires a window context. It's not really going to work on a server. In fact, if we try and refresh that page, it's probably going to crash. It's not going to crash. Oh, because none of these components are registered. The first thing is we actually need to use 3. Now, this tutorial, which is excellent, tells you how to use 3. But I want to show you a little cool thing that Nuxt can do. We're going to create a runtime module. This is super advanced. You really don't have to do this if you're just getting started with Nuxt. But Nuxt can do some very cool things. So we're going to import all the sort of library here, only really to know what it has. And then we are going to, for every export that it has, if that export is a capital, starts with a capital letter, because that's what their components are. They also have some utilities, which I'm not interested in. And this is a bit lazy, really. I'm going to add a component. So Nuxt has this concept that you can create components yourself, but you can also use a module, something which should exist and probably will exist soon. Once we've done this talk, you can go home and create your Nuxt Trois. Do you pronounce it Trois? Trois.js. That is how you pronounce it. OK. We're going to add a component. We're going to say it's going to have this export. Its path is going to be Trois. And its name is also going to be name. OK. Now, I've just saved that, which means my Nuxt config is restarting. And we should see that what happens is that we now have some extra files, some extra components appear in our components type declaration file. Unless Nuxt can't resolve it for whatever reason. For some reason it can't. Ah, you see what I've done there? OK, that's what we expect. So if we open now our components directory, we can see all these Trois components are automatically registered. This is what lots of Nuxt modules do. They make this kind of thing really easy for you. It means that all the stuff that we pasted in here is now fully typed for us. We don't need to import it directly from Trois because we've told Nuxt to auto-import it. But as I said, it's not compatible with our server. So we can do a couple of things. We can stick client-only around it. That will work. So now we have this little box appearing on the bottom of the screen, which we can move around. It's 3D. There's something else we can also do. We can say this component is actually going to be a client-only component. We're just going to add this client name. I'm actually just going to restart the server at the same time. That should also work fine. I want to, and that works for us. So again, we don't need to think about it. We just know that wherever we use that, it's only going to be loaded on the client side. I want to pull in a very cool model that a friend of mine, a guy called Alvaro, the guy actually who wrote this tutorial, go check him out on Twitter. We are going to go into our public directory, which doesn't yet exist. Let's create that. And we're going to unzip a hipster cat model. And we are going to not have a box here, but we're going to use this GLTF model. And what do we need to stick in? It needs a source key. So we're going to pull in this hipster clay cat. There it is. We can add a few more things. I think we might want some alpha. And I think we might want to anti-alias it as well. Again, you get these type helpers for you. There we go. Beautiful little cat. OK, now I want to tell you about something that's very exciting that we've been working on at Nuxt. And this isn't actually released. So I have a pre-release version of Nuxt running here. And that is root rules. So I'm going to deploy this in just a moment in seconds, absolute seconds. And we are going to do some incremental static generation. How does that sound? That is, we are going to say for all of the roots that start cat, we are going to use, we're going to make them totally static. So they'll be generated once on request. And we are also going to, what are we going to say? For our API endpoint, we are going to have all of our API endpoints have CORS headers added to them so that you can access. We should be able to see this right now, even with our demo app. If I were to hit the API cats and just look at the header response, we should be able to see that our headers have the CORS headers, the default ones added. And that if we were to hit API, we'd get cat, we would get some static ones as well. So I'm going to build this. I'm going to deploy this just now to Netlify, but this will work on other platforms as well. This works, by the way, all these kinds of root rules that we're talking about, they include things like turning on and off server-side rendering. So you might just say for an entire section of the site, this could be client-side only. You might be able to add custom headers. That also works in this particular build. And you can also do things more complex, like talk about pre-render, or let's create a new site. We're going to call it vuejs. And it's going to deploy this build that I've just created. What Nitro does under the hood, this Nuxt server, is it handles every platform that you might want to deploy on, from a node server to a node cluster to platforms like Azure, Cloudflare, Netlify, Versal. And it produces the right kind of shape of server. It configures the response. So in this case, we have some redirects that are going to tell we're going to use a builder function for that cat endpoint. We're going to use a normal Netlify function for everything else. And in this particular case, I haven't actually pre-rendered anything, but we could also pre-render some particular routes if we wanted to. We could say we're going to pre-render just the index page. But in this particular case, I just want to show you that it works. So we have a draft URL here. We're going to hit that draft URL in the browser. Cats of the world, unite. And actually, we're not getting a response from our... we need to pre-render at least one route. In most cases, one really helpful thing to be able to do, by the way, is just to be able to run your node server locally and see how it works, which I've obviously skipped in this particular case. So what Netlify is going to do for us, but by the way, the output of Nitro, I did a quick check before the talk. If you have a look at the output folder, which contains everything you need to use output is what it's normally called, but in the Netlify case, it's called server. You can see all the node modules that are required to run this deployed Nuxt app. It's 3 meg. If I were to open a Nuxt 2 project and look at the same thing, this is a production install with only the Nuxt start dependency. The node modules are 48 meg. It gives you a bit of a difference. In this Nuxt start project, I don't have enough time to go into all the details, but it starts in 300 milliseconds. This Nitro one starts in 3. Okay, so we have this draft URL here. We're going to hit it with our HTTP endpoint. You see our server response there. Very strange. The URL changed. Thank you. See our server response. You should also see that each of these pages was not pre-rendered in advance, but they're now fully static. So if we're going to hit any one of those now, it's going to have Netlify. It's going to be cached by Netlify permanently. It's in their endpoint, in their cache. It still has the original headers Nuxt added, but you should be able to see there's an age header that tells us that this is actually static. There is so much more to cover, and sadly, I don't have any more time to cover it today. But if you want to check out some of the things that we've got planned for building for the edge with Nuxt 3, check out the pending PRs on nitropack and Nuxt. There are all the root rules that I talked about ready to go, and there are some more exciting ones planned. It means you can build apps that are fully hybrid, have admin routes, have API routes, have some static pages. This, we think, is the future. Might not be, but we're doing our best to make it as exciting to build with, as pleasant, with as good a user experience as possible. Check out the documentation at v3.nuxtjs.org, and please message me on Twitter or Discord. I would love to help if I can. And of course, if you find a bug or an issue, let me know. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Oh, and if you want a Nuxt sticker, I threw some on a table in front, so feel free to come and get one and put it on your laptop. Thank you so much for having me.